Welcome back, everybody, to another video from the Sableyes. I'm here today with Jordan. How are we doing, Jordan?
I'm doing well, thank you.
That's good, and today we are taking a look at our Ultra Necrozma list, the list that we featured in our last matchup up against Blacephalon. And this deck, like many of the others that we're showing off, has a lot of potential in the upcoming Worlds format.
Yeah, Malamar just has so much going for right now because obviously, unlike a lot of the other decks that kept its main search engine with Mysterious Treasure, it probably uses Mysterious Treasure better than any other deck because not only is it most of your supporter Pokemon being Psychic types, but Ultra Necrozma itself is also a Dragon type.
That is 100% correct. Now, Malamar is being run in a number of variants at the moment, but we think that Ultra is probably the most powerful. But regardless of which variant you're running, you're probably going to have yourself a 4-4 Malamar line. Obviously, the ability to recharge Psychic Energy once they've been removed from play is incredibly important. When both of our attackers and all of our kind of tech cards require a lot of energy to get going, so it's really important to make sure that those Psychic recharges are active.
And the 4-4 line is 100% necessary, even though I've had a few people asking me now that there's no Guzma in the format, could we maybe cut the Malamar down a little bit because they're not going to be targeted as much, but I think it's super necessary still to play the 4-4 line, if for no other reason just to try and find them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and since things like Zapdos aren't going to be taking those quick Guzma knockouts anymore, then there's going to be people who are going to be tempted to do it, but don't, because you need them to in order to power up your attacker, which is going to be our 2 copies of Ultra Necrozma. Ultra Necrozma with Photon Geyser is incredibly powerful. The ability to do 180 for 3 energy, which is easily rechargeable, is super, super good. But Sky Scorching Light GX is probably one of the most important attacks that this deck has.
Yeah, it's the reason why this version of Malamar is typically favored in any mirror match, because you can set yourself up to be able to win with Sky Scorching Light. Trying to do so before your opponent means that you pretty much guarantee that there's no way for them to win the game. But overall, obviously Photon Geyser is the attack you're going to be using more, and in this current format where there's a lot of big tag team Pokemon like Pikachu, Zekrom, when you get a regular GX Pokemon that can take a one-hit KO on a tag team, it seems pretty strong to me.
Yeah, and if worst comes to worst, and maybe the one shot doesn't line up for you, you could use one of your 2 copies of Giratina in order to use Shadow Impact. This is probably one of the best attacks in the game right now. 130 for 3 energy is incredibly easy to do with this deck. Its downside is that you put 4 damage counters on one of your Pokemon, but that's not even that big of a deal. With Guzma not being in the format and with lots of other decks really struggling to find Gust, you can really hide that damage on the bench, and Giratina doesn't even mind having it on itself, considering the Distortion Door ability is so good.
Yeah, every now and again you might even find the damage from Shadow Impact is going to be beneficial at times, but typically it's not that big a deal regardless of where you put it. It's just such an efficient attacker. Once you've got 2 or 3 Malamar set up, you don't really need any cards to be able to attack with Shadow Impact every turn of the game, which is super strong. A lot of decks just can't deal with 6 non-GXs doing a half-hit KO on almost everything in the format every single turn of the game.
Yeah, it's very, very powerful, and like you said, if your board is set up, then you can effectively dead draw for the entire game and still attack every turn, which is incredibly important. And one card that this deck hasn't ran in the past, but now suddenly comes to the forefront, is 1 copy of Dawnwing's Necrozma. Dawnwing's Necrozma didn't see a lot of play in Ultra Malamar because Zoroark just easily took that knockout. It was just free 2 prizes for it. But Zoroark not being in the format, there's no real recognized dark type attackers that are going to take one-shots on this Dawnwings. We can really easily put it down and then use Moon's Eclipse GX in specific situations in order to lock our opponent out of taking prizes.
Moon's Eclipse is definitely a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card in this deck. You can kind of be in any awkward position where your opponent's got a really early advantage over you, and then Moon's Eclipse is going to be that GX attack that puts you right back into the game, where if you can catch him in an awkward spot, it can very easily be the swing card in a matchup that you're kind of unfavorable in. Because, as we've already mentioned a couple times, there's no Gust in this format, so that Moon's Eclipse effect is going to stay active for almost all the time, and there's not much your opponent can do about it. And you've also got the Invasion ability, which is a pretty useful ability in this format, considering we're seeing quite a few like status conditions going around. A couple of people using Raichu tag team for paralysis, so it's great to have that invasion ability ready to go at any time.
Yeah, and the best thing about Dawn Wings for me, one of the big tech cards that where people are starting to talk about to beat this deck is Hooper, which is going to be able to quite easily knock out Giratina, but Dawn Wings can easily return it. So normally if people are only playing one of them, then Dawn Wings could be your answer there, but hey, you've got to watch out. It's Dark Week, so look out for that one. We'll move on to our last 5 Pokemon. We have 3 copies of Jirachi in the list that we are running. Obviously, 4 would be great in order to start them, but ultimately, you don't really need any more than 1 on the field. 2's a bit of a luxury. If you're ever needing to use 3 Jirachis in a game, then you're probably going to be behind.
It's so weird to me that Jirachi is seeing as little play as it currently is in the format right now, because going into this post-rotation meta, I really felt like Jirachi was going to be the main way that most decks operated, just because of how many great search cards we've lost from the rotation. But Jirachi, especially in this deck, seems really strong, because just like when we saw Zapdos in the last format, Jirachi's really strong in a deck where you're always constantly switching your Pokemon around, and you want to have something on the bench, so you'll bring the Jirachi active every turn and get a free Stellar Wish. Ultra Cosmo is pretty similar to that, where you don't need to be on the bench every single turn like Zapdos does, but there are certainly a lot of turns where you're just going to want to play a switch to get your Ultra Cosmo on the bench, charge it up on the bench, and what better Pokemon to switch into than a Jirachi?
Yeah, that Stellar Wish ability is still so powerful, even though lots of the most useful item cards or trainer cards that you would normally be trying to pick up, Guzma, Nest Ball, Ultra Ball, are all rotated. Jirachi is still so powerful, so having one of those on the bench with perhaps an escape board or a switch in hand is not a bad idea. We also play in this list 1 copy of Bench Barrier Mew. This is our way of ensuring that we're able to hold off a big Tag Bolt GX from Pikachu Zekrom, as well as dealing with any spread decks that might come up. But spread's not really been seeing a huge amount of play at the moment. Another good thing that Mew's going to be able to do is to put damage counters on your opponent's side of the field and try and bait out that Sky Scorching Light GX attack, which could potentially get you the win.
With the combination of Giratina's Distortion Door and Mew's Psy Power, you can make some really unique plays that your opponent might not be expecting, where maybe you're able to get yourself into that Sky Scorching range a turn earlier than you'd usually be able to, or maybe even just using that combination of the 3 damage from Mew plus 10 from Giratina's Distortion Door to knock out a basic Pokemon on the bench like a Ditto Prism, which only has 40 HP. So it's actually a pretty decent attacker on this list, but I don't want to get tag bolted for losing multiple Malamars or a GX and a Malamar, so I'm happy to have a Mew in this list.
Yeah, it's the classic card that does its job and then adds a little extra on the side. You're not unhappy to have it in every matchup, but when you need it against Pikarom, it is incredibly important because they're going to try and target down things like this. The Dene GX, which we play 1 copy of, the ability to draw 6 cards is too powerful to pass up, but 160 HP is concerning, and with Pikarom seeing a lot of hype, the Dene GX is going to be a big target for those tag bolts, so we need to make sure that we've got the Mew down so that they can't take those 2 prizes.
Yeah, the Dene and Mew do take up a bit of bench space, so you do have to be a bit careful of when you use them, but for the most part, the amount of extra plays that you can make with Dene in the deck obviously increases your consistency overall, but it also just helps you with discarding the Pokemon that you need to discard, and the cards you need to discard. Obviously, Giratina is a card that you want to be escorting to the discard pile, as well as Psychic Energy you want to discard pile fairly quickly, so the Dene is just going to help your deck run a little smoother throughout the early game.
It certainly is, and we have to remind you every single time we played a Dene down, if your opponent has got its Thunder Mountain Stadium out, then you can potentially even use Tingly Return GX, which will paralyze and annoy and confuse your opponent. So just remember that one. That's a potential option for you. But it's a relatively standard Pokemon line, considering the fact that the cards that we are missing. And the same is going to go here for our supporter line. Our supporter line is going to look very thick, but very standard. We've got 4 copies of Lily, 3 copies of Cynthia, and 2 copies of Erica's.
Yep, fairly standard supporter line. The only difference being that we've got a couple extra Erica than I think what most lists are typically running at the moment. 4 Lilies, pretty standard. High Cynthia, pretty normal as well, but 2 copies of Erica does just help a lot in this deck. Obviously, it's strong in certain matchups such as mirror matches where your opponent's going to have a pretty big bench, but it just has general synergy with Jirachi engines in general because you're kind of just increasing your hand size every turn. You want to hold onto a big hand rather than shuffling everything back in, so you can use Erica to draw a whole bunch of cards, and that's Stellar Wish to fine-tune your hand to whatever you're missing.
Yeah, all 3 of these supporters are very powerful. Just depends on what you need on the turn that you need them. Onto our items, and like we said in the introduction to the video, Jordan, the thing that Ultra Malamar has that lots of other decks don't at the moment is a really thick ball search line. We've got 4 Pokecoms, 4 Treasure, and 2 copies of the brand new Cherish Ball, which means that this deck's going to be one of the more consistent decks in finding the Pokemon that they need to find.
Yep, even if you only have Cherish Ball for Dedenne and, of course, some of your Psychic and Dragon-type GXs, which can be found with Treasure anyway, the fact that it gets Dedenne and Treasure doesn't already means that Cherish Ball is a super strong inclusion to this deck. It's going to help with your early game inconsistencies, but also just finding a GX that you might not need with a Cherish Ball. You can use it, if you've got a Pokecoms in your hand as well, you can just use it to get a Pokemon you don't need, Pokecoms it back in, and all of a sudden you've got yourself an extra in-game play.
Yep, you do, and the best thing about this, the line's actually super consistent. I was actually playing a post-rotation deck minus the Cherish Balls in a standard tournament today, and I managed to set up every turn, so it seems to be pretty good. Obviously, not as good as Nest and Ultra, but it's still pretty solid. To go along with that, we've got what seems to be quite a staple card in most decks that aren't fire-based now, that is Custom Catcher. This is our only way of gusting, so having 4 copies of this card is really important. With Jirachi, we can search them out when we need them. We don't have the luxury of playing things like Volkner, but we do have the ability to find them when we need them, and getting 2 in those critical turns can be very important.
It is a little awkward, as you said. Obviously, this list not having Volkner means that it's a little harder to pull off Custom Catcher than I'd like, but this goes back to that engine we were just talking about with the Jirachi plus Erica, which allows you to effectively see 11 cards if you draw 6 off of an Erica and another 5 off of a Jirachi, plus the up to 4 cards you're holding already. As long as you're holding 1 Custom Catcher in your hand, you can dig pretty far to find a second one without having to shuffle the first in a lot of the time. So a lot of decent ways to find your Custom Catchers, and this is one of those decks where it's just such a strong effect that you only really need to pull off 1 a game for it to be worth it, so you don't have to be too scared of discarding 1 or 2 off of a Dedenne. As long as you've got 2 in deck for like the late to mid game when you really need it, you can hopefully find it when you desperately need it on that turn.
Yeah, it's just making sure that you get that critical knockout. And one of the ways we're going to try and get those critical knockouts, we need to remove Ultra Necrozma from the active in order to charge it up, so we're going to try and do that with 3 copies of Switch. I know, Jordan, we've played around with 4 copies in this deck. 3 seems to be okay at the moment, especially considering we also played 2 copies of Escape Board. We're going to want to put those on Jirachi if we can, but Inkay and Dedenne can also retreat for one colour, so Escape Board can be used there. 5 switch outs is reasonably good, and it's going to get us what we want most of the time, especially with Dawnwings being able to invade.
Yeah, it's pretty decent. Obviously, we're going to need a Skateboard on a Jirachi for most of the game if we want to take advantage of Stellar Wish the amount that we want to. The 3 switch is a little awkward, as you mentioned. I would love a 4th just to make sure that you're getting them every single time you need it, but with the Invasion, it's not too hard. If you have an Ultra Necrozma trapped in the active, you can always use Invasion with Dawnwings Necrozma, charge it up on the active, and then maybe attach an Escape Board to your Dawnwings to retreat. So there's certainly a few options to maneuver your Pokemon around.
Yeah, you're going to be able to get in and out when you need to. And worst case scenario, when you're falling behind, you can always play your 1 copy of Reset Stamp. Again, another card that I'd like to see a higher count of, but most decks playing between 1 and 2. I'm not unhappy to see it in the early game, but I'd much rather it in the late game when it's super powerful.
It is a little awkward because obviously there are some cards or some hands where you're just going to be forced to discard it in the early game. If you ever open with it with a hand that you need to use Dedenne, then it's going to be pretty awkward for you. But if you don't have to discard it with Dedenne, most of the other supporters in the deck are going to allow you to either hold on to it until you need it or shuffle it back in with Cynthia. So if you're careful with that resource, you're very rarely going to have to discard it. But but one copy should be fine for most of the games where you're not unlucky.
Yeah, it should be alright. And a relatively thick stadium line here, Viridian Forest. You might ask, well, why is that so high? Obviously, you do need to make sure that you've got energy in play, but the most important thing that it does is it gives you another out to discard your psychic energy. You need to make sure that they're in the bin, and without Ultra Ball, our only other realistic way of getting energy into the discard pile is through Mysterious Treasure or manually retreating, so Viridian Forest is our next best way of discarding those fire cards, those psychic energies, and allowing our Malamars to do their work.
Viridian is a super important card in this deck because not only does it help you with discarding your psychic, but it also allows you to find your metal, which is a much harder card to find in this deck. So having access to Viridian Forest as many turns as you can is really strong, especially when a whole bunch of the other top decks in the format are playing relatively high stadium counts with cards like Thunder Mountain and Heat Factory, which you want to kind of get rid of as soon as you can. So Viridian Forest is a card you almost always want to have in play, I would say.
That is 100% correct. And the best thing about Viridian Forest is that lots of other decks find it really, really useful, so they might be playing them as well. Obviously means that your opponent's going to be able to search out energy when they want to, but that's okay. As long as we've got ourselves set up, we should be fine. And the energy that we're going to be searching for, we're going to be looking for one of 7 psychic energy. 7 there we go. Let's make them a little bit easier to see. This is the bread and butter of the deck, obviously. We want to make sure that we've got access to those psychics. Giratina needs 3. Ultra Necrozma needs 3 for damage to knock out a tag team. So you're going to need large numbers of these in the discard early. We also have 2 copies of Metal Energy, which can be searched using Viridian, just like you mentioned, and 1 copy of Beast, which is able to expand the damage of Ultra Necrozma, as well as expanding the damage of Dawnwings if required.
Changing Dawnwings from 180 damage to 210 damage isn't quite as relevant as it used to be potentially, but it does still hit some pretty important numbers. Specifically, in a mirror match, if you're not able to go for Sky Scorching Light, then you can always consider using your Dawnwings to Necrozma to try and knock out an opposing Ultra Necrozma with a Beast Energy attached to it. So you've certainly got a few options with the Beast Energy, but for the most part, it's there for your Ultra Necrozma because it allows you to get a one-hit KO with Reshizard, on a Reshizard for slightly cheaper than you usually would be able to.
Yeah, those big numbers are kind of hard to hit. 270 is realistically the highest number we're going to need to get to. 3 energy and 3 psychic energy and a beast does 270, so that's perfect numbers. And that's the best thing about this deck is it's one of the only decks that can realistically take a knockout on a Pokemon that has 270 HP. Obviously, if Mew tag team becomes very big, then this deck is also going to be very powerful. Having a 1 prize attacker, non-GX, taking 3 prizes with 1 tick of a Distortion Door is also very powerful. So this deck is definitely going to be one to look out for at World Championships.
I'd be very surprised if this deck isn't one of, if not the most played deck, I would say, in at least day 1 of the tournament, because it's the deck that everyone knows is strong and it works well. It's just like Pikarom, but I feel like in the end, people are gonna maybe gravitate more towards this non-GX style of deck when they realize how well it works.
Yeah, it's an exceptionally powerful deck with lots of options. The best thing about it is we've got some thick counts, we've got some thinner counts. We could do a bit of fiddling around. You can find some room. You want to be risky, you can cut a Malamar maybe. Maybe you can cut a Cherish Ball or maybe even a Viridian Forest if you're feeling super crazy. And there's space. You can fit stuff into this deck if you want to. So that's another good thing the deck's got going for it. But I'm sure we'll see some more techs over the next couple of weeks. And hopefully we can bring you more Ultra Necrozma from the Sableyes. So thanks for being here, Jordan, for this one.
Not a problem.
And thanks everyone for coming along and watching. If you like the content, then please consider liking and subscribing by clicking the Sableye in the middle of the screen. On the left-hand side, you'll see a couple of videos that YouTube thinks that you might like. And on the right, we have our Unified Minds World Championships playlist. Thanks everyone for coming along, and we'll see you all next time for more from the Sableyes. Bye.